Hello, everyone. Our next speaker is Roi Shternin, and Roi served as the first ever patient in residence and the head of patient innovation for the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute in Austria, and is currently acting as a board member in several health organizations. Now, he is here to talk to us about why you need to have a chief patients officer. He will talk about his incredible real life medical story and how he created a new profession in healthcare care from his sickbed. So, without further ado, I present to you Roy. Roy, just a quick note, you are muted.
Hey guys, I'm going to share my presentation with you. I'm so thankful for you for having me today, and let's start. So, what is a chief patient officer? This is something I get asked a lot because I'm writing about it. I'm talking about it in podcasts, and I'm doing a lot of promotion to this profession that was not even existed up until 2 years ago. And before I start, I think it's super important for you to understand something about me. How did I invented a new profession? So my story is a bit different. It's more of a medical mystery that deserves to be in a house episode or a diagnosis episode on Netflix than anything else. To the matter of fact, actually, my illness was featured in both of them. Not me personally, but with other patients. So I start my story as a young soldier in the Israeli Defense Forces. I'm from Israel, and everything was going well. I'm on a right track of life, joining the military, supposed to become a paramedic in the military, was deployed already to the field, and one day there was a major traumatic event in the army, and I'm starting to feel unwell. I'm starting to feel unwell physically, I'm starting to feel unwell emotionally, and as weeks goes by, I'm getting sicker and sicker and sicker until a few months later, I could not longer serve in the military. I'm honorably discharged. And then I'm starting a very strange journey through healthcare. And I really hope none of you ever have to go through healthcare like I have. But there is a difference between going to the doctor, asking for something when you have a cold, or you cut yourself, you need some stitches, and everything is over in a few hours. But when you're a chronically ill patient or somebody who is underdiagnosed or undiagnosed, the show is completely different. And what happened with me is that basically I was thrown away to the community healthcare system of Israel, which is considered one of the best in the world. I was treated by really, really good doctors. Some of them were ward or department heads, some of them were hospital heads, but still, I had no diagnosis. What's relevant to our story today is to realize that what I did unknowingly is that I went through healthcare exploring it not only as a user, but also as an observer and as a future entrepreneur. A lot of things bothered me. And why does it have to do with data science conference and with technology? It has a lot to do with it because I was dramatically surprised to see that even in Israel, which have probably one of the best health IT systems in the world, things are not working so well. Yes, it was like 15 years ago, but even back then, we were very, very advanced. We had unified healthcare record systems. We had already data collection being done, data analysis being done, but still, treatment for me as a user, as an end user of the system, or as what we call B2B to C, like the person who eventually the doctor treats, who they use the systems, it was completely horrible. I went through the system and it took me a few years to get worse and worse and worse. And no matter which doctor I've seen, nothing really helped. And after 3 years in bed, losing almost 30 kilograms, I was a human skeleton. I could not move anymore. I would even faint just by moving my head to the side or trying to lift myself up. Doctors basically gave up on me, leaving me to not only for my own devices, but also telling me that I will never walk a day in my life, never talk. never go to university, never work, never marry a man or a woman, and basically left me for my own devices. I think that actually built me as a human, as a person, and as an entrepreneur. What I realized is that we as patients have an amazing, huge power to make a difference in healthcare. I've started by mapping my own body as my own startup. And what I did basically is to design myself a roadmap. Yes, just like startups do. And I had to find a solution for this vertical problem that was my illness because it had no name, it had no shape, no treatment. So I designed a 2-year program to myself to actually research enough to do R&D about my illness, to find a diagnosis, and then to develop the product that is my rehabilitation process. Eventually, I did all of those. And after almost 2 years, I was not only with a diagnosis that was confirmed by my professors, I was with a rehabilitation program that I've developed and later on productized by launching the Israeli Society of Dysautonomia and POTS syndrome, which is my illness, and trying to replicate it to other patients. What took me to an entrepreneurial route, I started 5 startups, I started a few health NGOs and patients associations, but it wasn't enough. What I realized is that the problem with healthcare is that patients are not part of it. Patients are not being any part of decision making in healthcare. And as the end user of the system, our input really doesn't matter. So I came up with this idea that not only we have to incorporate technologies in healthcare and better training for our doctors and nurses to better communicate with doctors, because all I had was a simple miscommunication. My illness could have been diagnosed in basically 10 minutes in a clinic setting, not even in a hospital ward. But I realized that I need to start a new profession. And I called it a patient in residence. This was the first stage. And a patient in residence is somebody who's coming for like 6 months or 3 months of residency, just like doctors do when they visit another hospital or another university. And this patient is an expert of his own life and his own illness. In academy, they call us experts by living experience. So what I said is, let's take patients and insert them into organizations, and any organization that has any interface whatsoever with patients need the patient in residence or a chief patient officer. But the difference will only come a bit later, and I will talk about it a bit longer. And this is a quote from a famous guy called Roi Shternin, which is me. Healthcare is the only industry that does not adapt based on a user input, rather on an outcome of a process. So basically, the system shapes by doing something wrong, usually, not by doing something right. And it's the only industry in the world that doesn't really care about the user input. And it's only now in the last 2-3 years I'm seeing a bit more service orientation. Like in Israel, we have 2 hospitals that have service experts or service officers, and there is one hospital, Sheba Medical Center, that you should all pay attention to, that is on the front lines of health innovation in general, that actually did a further step forward, and I will mention them later. But what is wrong in this industry? And I'm talking not about only hospitals, I'm talking about health startups, health NGOs, corporate, and every major corporate now, Amazon, Google, Walmart, and such, they are going to be the largest HMOs, the largest health providers in the next decade. Every single one of them should have people who are experts for patients. But who is the expert of patient? Is it the doctor? Is it the nurse? Actually, it is a patient. And what I want to stress is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just need to incorporate patients in decision making. And PIR is a patient in residence. That's what I did for the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute. It's the National Health Research Institution of Austria, with more than 600 people working for it. And somebody heard my talk there, and they told me, hey, why don't we start this experiment? And then I came there for 8 months of residency. And what we did was trying to develop the system that will not only deal with research, but also policymaking and technology and innovation management adoption, because we thought that maybe if we have patients as leaders in the system, we can better adapt technologies for the organizations, because we're not only using an innovation manager to assess it, we're using an actual patient expert. And we're not only using patients to have a questionnaire to answer us in a focus group, but when we designed a companion app for prostate cancer patients, part of the team was actually co-designed with actual prostate cancer patients. But this was just the beginning. What I'm saying is that if you have a short-term process like research, you have a corporate, you have a startup, you have an organization that you want to work with patients, no matter if they're your direct users or they're a byproduct of it, like a B2B2C, you need somebody on board, maybe at the beginning as an advisors, to help you understand what do patients need, what do patients want. So even if you have a startup and the startup is aiming for doctors, yes, doctors are going to eventually treat patients. So we also need to get this input too. How do this kind of becoming from a patient in residence, this expert that comes and go to a chief patient officer, this is the interesting part. Because when I realized after working in my own few startups, and in one of them I actually was the chief patient officer, and we did add-ons for medical record system in the US working with Athena Health. And I realized that this is not enough. I can say, yeah, patient needs to feel like this, patient needs to feel like this, but there is an entire product development process. And this product development process needs something that is along the line of a chief product officer, but which is also kind of a chief happiness officer, and also a bit of kind of a chief training officer in the same package. But like, how do we do it? How do we find the right people? So yes, it's hard to find somebody who is an entrepreneur, a chronically ill patient, a startup founder, a policymaker, somebody with an advanced degree in healthcare management or so on. This is kind of hard, right? I did all of those because I'm kind of in a special journey, but I'm not expecting every startup to find somebody like that. But I really think that those amazing officers can be trained. I really think that the main thing that we need to consider is that this person has underwent chronic illness or prolonged illness, which is acute, like cancer, or took care of one as a first-hand caretaker. And with this living experience, alongside entrepreneurial experience and technology understanding and training, maybe even medical training of some sort, because people come from a varied direction, those people can be an amazing patient in residence because they come from, one of them is a professor who is a patient, one of them is a technologist who is a patient or take care of a patient. But when we want to leverage it, we need to move to another layer, which is to train patient officers or chief patient officers. And how do we do it? This is something I'm working on right now. I'm the founder of the Patient School, and we developed a platform for patient education. But when I move on with my project and I'm working with hospitals like Sheba Healthcare, with Sheba Medical Center was the first hospital in the world, as far as I know, that actually trained chief patient officers indoors. And not only that, they call it the human experience department, and it's an entire perception and a field of operation within the medical center. And you need to understand, this is a huge healthcare system in Israel and now also in the Emirates, and they have Sheba Beyond that they work internationally advising how to set up new hospital systems. So this is a true revolution unfolding. How do we take these people and train them? So right now, I'm developing a program to actually train those people, and I'm actually writing my master thesis on it. And I think that if we consider starting with somebody who is a resident to help us, we can later on train patients to be patients, not only in residence, but chief patient officers. So every organization that has any interface with patients whatsoever needs it. If you're directly talking to patients as your users, if you're talking to patient as a byproduct, like, or some sort of a side user. So I'm having a product for nurses or doctors or hospitals, but they treat patients. This is also great. If you're only dealing with healthcare professionals, still you need to remember, entire healthcare is built around patients. I know sometimes it doesn't feel like this as a patient, but we need to remember it, that we are the force that drives healthcare. Because imagine a factory, right? Patients sometimes feel like a raw materials going through a hospital, and you treat you like a material, and there is something popping up in the end. But the hospital cannot function without patients, right? Patients cannot function without somebody taking care of them. We need to bring those two together and not only improve communication, but improve also decision making. I really think that we should not only open to the idea of developing patient schools, which is a subject I'm vigorously working on, that every healthcare system needs a patient academy to teach patients how to better control, direct, and get a sense of purpose in their life as patients, because then it shows better healthcare outcomes. We need people to represent those patients along those lines. And the way to train them is to start to putting together the pieces that we already have and start those trials. And I'm calling here to any organization that want to start this trial with me. I'll be more than happy to cooperate and see how can we bring the first cohort of chief patient officers into life. And I want to say another thing about being a patient. I think that when we develop technologies, when we talk about analyzing data of patients, we are talking about people eventually. I know sometimes it's anonymized, sometimes it's an Excel sheet or an XLS or a set of data, but we need to remember that these are real people, and those people will not get better treatment if we do not consider their actual needs. If we're talking about better outcomes, we're talking about decision support systems, we're talking about improving the lives of healthcare professionals or patients by using amazing technologies like AI and machine learning and all the amazing things we've been talking about in the past few days. Nothing worth it and nothing will work properly if we do not take the end user, which, as I mentioned, is the patient anyway, into consideration. The way to do it is to look at it as a simple product development process. And when you have experts in product development, you have the CTO, you have the chief product officers, you have the developers, you have sometimes other stakeholders. You need like a chief medical officer or another knowledge officer. We are talking about the fact that eventually, at the end of the day, we still need the patient inside. And if we train patients to become chief patient officers, and if we as organizations that deal with patients in one way or another adopt the idea of a chief patient officer, I think that eventually we will create better healthcare and eventually a better world. Thank you so much, and I would love to take questions right now.
Okay. Thank you for the insight, and especially your incredible story. Going a bit about the all the uses that a chief patients officer could actually have in a healthcare company, and linking it back to data. How easy do you think having this one person to have to potentially even help collect all the data from the patients would ease this transition and make products easier for a healthcare company in any field?
So I think that it's an entire talk by itself that I wish that in the next data science conference, we'll have maybe our CTO or somebody who is expert of data collection from patient talking about this conjunction, because right now we're talking about data collection, right? It's a very macro. I think that the difference is, and if we're taking co-designing, open innovation system or design thinking, usually what we do is that we collect insights from patients regarding a certain process or a product. So we put a bunch of patients in the room, and I must tell you, this is mainly happening within pharma. Pharma industry is the only industry who cared enough about their users, their patients, to appoint kind of chief patients officer. It was chief patient engagement officer to start with, but they collect data usually by putting those people with patients in one room and collect kind of a qualitative data. When we move to the quantitative data, we need to put somebody in charge to kind of not only put these two things together, but to set up processes that involve training. And this is why I'm talking about patients academies, because we want to train patients in how to provide patient-reported outcome to us, how to report to us with data. We need to use wearables, of course. We need to use other methods, but it's a layered system. We have patients not only as focus groups, but we have patients and leaders. And this transition will create better data collation and better data analysis, because when we don't look at these numbers only as raw numbers, but we looked at other parameters that I'm sure we're missing. Because if we're not asking the patients for what they really need and what their struggle is, for instance, we have a lot of patients that stop taking medications or reduce their medication doses because they don't know what to do. They need to see their doctor in 3 months maybe, and they have nobody to talk to. So how do we know if an outcome of a treatment is working if we don't have the data? And if we ask patients, how do you behave in your daily life, and connect it to a product development and data collection process, I think it can be much more efficient.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the answer. And let's say, looking further ahead into the future, how do you see this position potentially even developing further? Because you said this was born out of the patient in residence, then the chief patients officer. So how do you see the progress, the evolution of this position, because it's still relatively new, as we go further on and as more hospitals and other healthcare companies start accepting it?
So I'm not a futurist, right? Maybe as a thought leader, we are expected to be some sort of health futurist. But if you ask me 2-3 years ago, it was a kind of a wild dream of having a patient in residence. I didn't even call it that way exactly. And then we defined it with the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute. We started that. And then I said we need a patient, which is a chief patient officer. I think it's going to be prevalent as much as we're going to see in any startup, probably a chief health officer, not only chief medical officer, because we're going to take a look at wellness and prevention and promotion connected with education, health education, medical education for the professionals, and patient education for the patients. And we're going to see medical or health officers. We're going to see chief patient officers in any startup organization that deals with patients. And eventually, we're going to see more leaderships of patients. So I'm not excluding a patient being a CEO of this company. I'm not excluding a patient being a chief of a hospital or a healthcare organization, because it's if you ask nurses 50, 60 years ago, it was the same problem. There were doctors and then nurses, and today nursing is so advanced, and we have nurses as chief of hospitals. Everywhere that we have a chief nursing officer, a chief medical officer, we need a chief patient officer. So I think it's going to be seeping through and connected with product and technology. It's going to also come to our realms and not only stay in healthcare.
And one final question. As we said, the awareness of the potential of this position goes ahead. How do you think the implementation will be? Will it be a more top-down approach or more a bottom-up approach on actually getting this position accepted?
It's super interesting. I think it's a bit from the bottom, seeping through. And with people like me that have the honor to be kind of a more path makers or kind of pioneers in the field, I think it has a lot to do with thought leadership as a whole. And eventually we're going to see those pioneer startups. I haven't met any startups other than my own that has a chief patient officer. There is an amazing charity that in Germany called the Hippo Foundation, dealing with AI solutions in healthcare to democratize and open it as an open source. They have a chief medical officer, so we have already 2 or 3 NGOs, and I think everything in startups was kind of shaped by this trends. So if we see more startups, more corporates having this, eventually it's going to seep through. And the only way to do it is to make a real profession out of it with real training. And this is what I'm trying to also prove academically, that this can be an actual profession, certified, maybe even studied academically, and then seep through.
Great, thank you for all the insights. Definitely one of those things that deals with innovation quite a bit. So that's it for the questions. I would just like to thank you on behalf of the conference for attending the event and giving us this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it as well.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure being here, and thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.